Imagine reading a newspaper from 1969, the headlines stark and shocking. Barbara Hutton, the Woolworth heiress, dies in a modest hotel room, reportedly with barely a penny to her name. It's a statement that defies belief, a final, cruel paradox for a woman born into nearly unimaginable fortune, a woman once celebrated as the richest girl in the world. This is the captivating, heartbreaking enigma at the center of our story today, the true saga of a life so filled with opulence and yet so barren of happiness that it became the stuff of legend, a story more dramatic and ultimately more tragic than any work of fiction. She was famously dubbed the poor little rich girl, and that nickname wasn't just a catchy phrase. It was the defining truth of her existence, a life lived in the glaring spotlight of wealth, yet shadowed by profound personal misery. We're about to journey back into the Gilded Age and beyond, into a world of staggering inheritances, relentless press attention, and a desperate, lifelong search for love in all the wrong places. This is the story of Barbara Hutton, an heiress to the Woolworth dime store empire, who received a fortune so vast on her 21st birthday that it would be worth hundreds of millions today. Yet that very fortune became a gilded cage, attracting a procession of suitors and 7 husbands, each relationship seemingly another chapter in a deeper story of loneliness and disillusionment. The money promised her the world, but it could never purchase the one thing she truly yearned for: a sense of peace, purpose, and unconditional love. So how does a person with everything end up with nothing? How does a life paved with gold lead to such a desolate and lonely ending? Over the course of this video, we will unravel the complex tapestry of her life, a saga of money, marriage, and misery that spans continents and decades. We'll explore the glittering parties, the famous friends, the stunning jewels, and the devastating betrayals. We'll meet the characters who shaped her destiny and uncover the choices that led her from the pinnacle of high society to a quiet, penniless death. This is not just a biography. It's a deep dive into a human tragedy on an epic scale, a cautionary tale about the true cost of fortune when it comes without foundation. Get ready for a story that will captivate you, surprise you, and perhaps break your heart just a little. To understand the immense weight Barbara Hutton carried, we must first look to its origin, a story of American ambition that began not in a palace, but in a humble store. Her grandfather was Frank Winfield Woolworth, a man who fundamentally changed the landscape of American retail. He didn't invent the concept, but he perfected it, creating the first successful 5 and dime store, a place where a fixed, low price made a world of goods accessible to the masses. From that single store in Utica, New York, he built a sprawling empire of variety stores, recognizable by their iconic red-fronted facades that stretched across the nation and into other countries. By the time of his death in 1919, the Woolworth Company was a retail behemoth, a testament to a particular kind of relentless, bootstrap-driven American success. This was the foundation of the fortune, built not on old-world aristocracy, but on nickels and dimes. A mountain of wealth accumulated one small purchase at a time. That mountain of wealth landed squarely on the shoulders of his granddaughter, Barbara, on a day that should have been a celebration of her future. On her 21st birthday in the year 1933, At the height of the Great Depression, when millions were standing in bread lines, Barbara Hutton was handed a fortune so vast it was almost abstract. The inheritance was reported to be worth $42 million. But when you account for the full value of the trusts and holdings, the actual figure was likely closer to $50 million. In today's terms, that translates to well over $1 billion, instantly making her the richest girl in the world. Newspapers breathlessly covered the event, splashing her photo across front pages, cementing her public identity not as a person, but as a walking, talking embodiment of unimaginable wealth. While the world around her was grappling with poverty and despair, she was presented with a level of financial security that was utterly divorced from the reality of everyday life. This instant, staggering wealth, however, came with a profound and hidden psychological cost. Imagine for a moment receiving such a fortune not as a reward for your own hard work or ambition, but simply as an accident of your birth. There is no striving, no struggle, no earned accomplishment attached to it. For Barbara, this created a deep and abiding sense of purposelessness. What was there left to achieve? Her life's trajectory was already set, her every material need guaranteed for 1,000 lifetimes. The fortune acted as a barrier, isolating her from the genuine, often messy, human experiences that give life its texture and meaning. It created a vacuum where ambition should have been, and into that vacuum rushed a nagging question. If she was valued for her money, then who was she without it? This inheritance wasn't a key that unlocked doors. It was a gilded cage that separated her from the world, making it nearly impossible to discern who was a true friend and who was merely a suitor to her fortune. The pressure of this public identity was immense. From that birthday forward, she was forever the poor little rich girl, a label that simultaneously evoked envy and pity. The world watched her every move, judging her extravagances and her heartbreaks as public entertainment. This lack of a genuine, self-defined purpose, combined with the relentless scrutiny, framed her entire inheritance not as the blessing it appeared to be, but as the root cause of her lifelong struggles. The money solved every practical problem, but created an existential one. It offered her everything the material world could provide, yet it systematically denied her the very things the human spirit needs to thrive: a sense of earned worth, authentic connection, and a reason to get out of bed in the morning that went beyond spending more of what she had not earned. The Woolworth fortune was not merely a bank account. It was a pre-written destiny, one that Barbara Hutton would spend the rest of her life trying and ultimately failing to escape. While that immense fortune presented a nearly insurmountable external challenge, the roots of Barbara Hutton's profound unhappiness stretched back to a childhood that was emotionally barren long before she received her first dollar. Her story truly begins not with wealth, but with a devastating loss that shattered her world at a tender age. When Barbara was just 5 years old, her mother, Edna Woolworth Hutton, was found dead in what was officially ruled a suicide. The specific circumstances were shrouded in the polite silence of the era, but the brutal, unchangeable fact remained. Her mother was gone forever. For a young child, the death of a parent is a cataclysm, a foundational earthquake that fractures their sense of security. But a suicide carries an additional, complex layer of trauma, often leaving behind a legacy of unanswered questions and a haunting sense of abandonment. That single tragic event in 1912 became the primal wound of Barbara's life, an emotional void that no amount of money could ever hope to fill. In the wake of this catastrophe, one might hope for a father to step in and provide the comfort and stability his daughter so desperately needed. But Franklin Laws Hutton was a man ill-equipped for such a role. A successful stockbroker and a partner in the firm that would eventually become Merrill Lynch, he was a quintessential figure of his time, ambitious, driven, and emotionally remote. He responded to his wife's death not by drawing his daughter closer, but by effectively withdrawing from her life. Franklin was frequently absent, consumed by his business and his own grief, leaving Barbara to be raised by a rotating cast of governesses, nannies, and household staff in a series of opulent but emotionally cold environments. Her primary residence became a sprawling, mansion-filled estate on New York's Long Island, a place of immense physical space that echoed with a profound emotional emptiness. She had everything a child could possibly want in a material sense, except for the one thing she truly needed: the unconditional, present love of a parent. This upbringing in luxurious isolation created a deeply distorted understanding of relationships and affection. The staff who cared for her were paid employees. Their kindness was a professional duty, not a genuine emotional offering. There was no one to soothe her night terrors, to celebrate her small triumphs, or to offer the consistent, reliable presence that builds a child's sense of self-worth. She was the lonely princess in the ivory tower, gazing out at a world from which she was utterly disconnected. This isolation bred a deep-seated insecurity, a whispering internal voice that constantly questioned her own lovability. If her own father, the one person who should have been a constant in her life, was so distant and disinterested, what did that say about her? She began to internalize a belief that she was fundamentally unworthy of love for who she was, a belief that would later compel her to seek validation through the one thing she did possess in abundance: her fortune. The desperate craving for affection that would come to define her adult life was forged in these lonely years. Every child needs a mirror in their parents' eyes to see their own value reflected back at them. Barbara looked into her father's eyes and saw only a vacant space. The emotional starvation of her childhood created a hunger so powerful, it became the driving force behind her entire existence. She would spend the rest of her life in a frantic, often disastrous, search for someone to finally see her, to love her, to fill that bottomless pit of need left by a mother who vanished and a father who was never truly there. The men she would later marry were not just partners. In her mind, they were potential saviors, each one carrying the unconscious hope that he would be the one to finally provide the paternal, all-encompassing love she had been denied since the age of 5. This desperate, unhealed childhood yearning set the stage for a lifetime of relational tragedy, proving that the most damaging poverty is not a lack of money, but a deficit of love. And so, against this backdrop of profound emotional poverty, the public spectacle of Barbara Hutton's life began in earnest with an event designed to showcase her as the ultimate prize of high society, her debutante ball. It was December 1930, a time when the Great Depression was tightening its grip on the nation, with breadlines lengthening and despair deepening for millions. Yet in the opulent ballroom of New York's Ritz-Carlton Hotel, a scene of almost mythical extravagance unfolded. The party, orchestrated by her father and her aunt, cost a then astronomical $60,000, a sum that could have fed thousands of families for months. The venue was transformed into a Venetian carnival, overflowing with thousands of roses and orchids, featuring a custom-built dance floor and an orchestra playing for a guest list that read like a who's who of American aristocracy. For one night, Barbara was presented as America's perfect golden girl, descending a grand staircase in a gown of delicate lace, a living symbol of fantasy and escape for a struggling public. The media frenzy that followed was unprecedented. Newspapers and magazines, hungry for a story of glamour to distract from the grim economic news, christened her the Princess of Paraphernalia and the $1 million debutante. Her face was everywhere, and the public couldn't get enough. They weren't just watching a party. They were consuming a fairy tale, a real-life Cinderella story where the glass slipper was a $42 million inheritance. She became an American princess, a figure of aspiration and, for some, resentment. Yet, this meticulously crafted public image was a gilded mask hiding a deeply vulnerable and isolated young woman. Inside that lavish ballroom, surrounded by hundreds of guests, Barbara was utterly alone. The smiles were polite, the conversations superficial. Everyone wanted a piece of the heiress, but no one was truly seeing the grieving, insecure girl hiding beneath the jewels in the headline. The ball was less a celebration of her coming of age and more a public auction of her availability, setting a precedent that her worth was directly tied to her wealth and social standing. This stark contrast between public perception and private reality became the central conflict of her young adulthood. The world saw a confident, privileged young woman who had everything one could possibly desire. But in private, she was riddled with self-doubt, still haunted by the loss of her mother and the emotional neglect of her father. The relentless media attention created a prison of expectations, forcing her to maintain a facade of happy perfection while her inner world crumbled. She began to understand that her fortune was a magnet, attracting a constant stream of people, but it also acted as a barrier, making genuine connection nearly impossible. How could she ever know if someone liked her for herself? This deep-seated vulnerability and the desperate need for validation, so carefully hidden from the flashing cameras, created a dangerous pattern. She started to believe that the only way to feel seen, to feel loved, was to secure the attention of a prominent, powerful man, as if his public affection could finally confirm her own worth. The stage was now set for a series of high-profile relationships, not born out of mature love, but out of a profound and aching need to fill the void that even $60,000 worth of flowers could never hope to conceal. Into this volatile mix of immense wealth and profound emotional need stepped a figure who seemed to be the answer to all her youthful fantasies, a man who offered not just affection, but a title. His name was Alexis Mdivani, a charismatic and handsome man who presented himself as a Georgian prince, a refugee from a lost royal world. What Barbara did not fully grasp at the time was that Alexis was a key player in a notorious family enterprise. He and his siblings, a band of self-styled nobles, were famously known in international society as the Marrying Mdivanis, a clan whose primary occupation appeared to be the strategic pursuit and acquisition of wealthy heiresses. They were the original fortune hunters, charming, well-connected, and utterly deliberate in their romantic campaigns. For Alexis, the young, vulnerable Woolworth heiress was not just a potential wife. She was the ultimate prize, a seemingly naive American girl whose bank account could finance a lifetime of aristocratic pretension. Their courtship was a whirlwind of glamour and intense, focused attention. After the suffocating isolation of her childhood and the overwhelming spectacle of her debutante ball, the concentrated affection from a man who called himself a prince must have felt like a lifeline. Here was someone who appeared to see past the newspaper headlines and the dollar signs, or so she desperately wanted to believe. He offered her a storybook escape, a chance to become a real princess, to leave behind the labels of debutante and heiress for a royal title that promised a sense of established identity and old-world respectability that new American money could never buy. The relationship moved with breathtaking speed, a clear indication that this was less a slow-building romance and more a transaction hurtling toward its inevitable conclusion. The wedding, when it arrived in June of 1933, was a lavish affair perfectly suited for the front pages, held in a grand Parisian townhouse. Barbara, just 21 years old, was radiant in a stunning Mainbacher gown, while Alexis cut a dashing figure in his formal attire. To the outside world, it was the perfect culmination of a modern fairy tale, the richest girl in the world marrying her prince. Yet, for those who were paying closer attention, the red flags were already waving. The Mdivani family was notoriously present, their celebratory mood perhaps a little too transparent. More tellingly, just before the wedding, Barbara's own father, Franklin Hutton, presented her with a stark and cynical prenuptial agreement, a legal document designed to protect her fortune from her new husband's grasp. It was a brutal, business-like intervention that spoke volumes about what he thought of the union and the man she was marrying. The very fact that Barbara signed it suggests a flicker of awareness, or perhaps a deep-seated need to please her father, even as she rushed headlong into a marriage he so clearly disapproved of. The fairy tale facade began to crack almost the moment the wedding celebrations ended. The marriage was tumultuous and brief, lasting barely 2 years. The prince, who had promised a life of romantic bliss, quickly revealed his true priorities. Alexis Mdivani proved to be a spendthrift of legendary proportions, draining vast sums from Barbara's fortune to fund his extravagant lifestyle, support his family, and engage in risky business ventures. The intense, charming attention he had showered upon her during their courtship evaporated, replaced by indifference and the clear understanding that his role in her life had been largely fulfilled upon their exchange of vows. For Barbara, the grim reality set in with crushing force. The title of Princess Mdivani felt hollow and meaningless when the man who gave it to her showed so little genuine interest in the woman she was. The marriage became a cruel mirror, reflecting back her deepest fears, that she was indeed unlovable for herself, and that her fortune was the only thing of value she possessed in the eyes of others. Within a shockingly short time, the glittering facade of Barbara's royal marriage crumbled into a pile of bitter recriminations and public scandal. The man who had promised her a storybook life was, in reality, a serial philanderer who pursued affairs with a brazen lack of discretion, flaunting his infidelities in the very social circles they both inhabited. The intense, singular attention he had lavished on her during their courtship was now dispersed among other women, a humiliation that cut Barbara to her core. Alongside the emotional betrayal was a financial one of staggering proportions. Alexis Mdivani lived with a sense of entitlement to his wife's fortune, spending her money with a recklessness that seemed designed to prove his ownership of it. He showered his family with lavish gifts, funded dubious business schemes, and maintained a lifestyle of extreme luxury, all while treating Barbara with growing indifference. The prince had secured his treasure, and the princess in the tower found herself more alone than ever, locked in a marriage that was a hollow, expensive parody of her childhood dreams. The emotional toll of this very public failure was catastrophic for Barbara. Instead of healing the primal wound of abandonment left by her mother's death and her father's neglect, this first marital venture ripped it wide open. It confirmed her deepest, most terrifying insecurity, that she was fundamentally unworthy of authentic love. In her mind, if a man who had pursued her so ardently could so easily discard her emotionally once the legal bonds were sealed, it must be because there was something intrinsically unlovable about her. This belief began to cement a destructive psychological pattern that would dictate the course of her life. She started to equate the intense, initial pursuit of a suitor with genuine love, only to feel blindsided and betrayed when the reality of the relationship failed to match the fantasy. Her method of coping was not to retreat and heal, but to desperately seek validation again in the arms of the next charismatic man who promised her the world, hoping that this time the ending would be different. The formal end of the marriage in 1935 was as much a business transaction as the wedding had been a strategic acquisition. The divorce was bitter and public, played out across the gossip columns of 2 continents. To secure her freedom, Barbara was forced to pay a king's ransom. The financial settlement she provided to Alexis Mdivani was reported to be well over $1 million, a colossal sum in the midst of the Great Depression, effectively making him a very wealthy man for the rest of his life. This payout established a devastating and costly precedent for all her future divorces. Every suitor who came after Mdivani now had a clear, publicly documented price tag for marrying and then leaving the Woolworth heiress. It signaled to the world that a union with Barbara Hutton was perhaps the most lucrative short-term career move a man could make. She had not just ended a bad marriage, she had inadvertently created a blueprint for financial predation, ensuring that her heart and her fortune would remain permanently intertwined in the most damaging way possible. Scarcely had the ink dried on her divorce papers from Mdivani when Barbara Hutton, still reeling from the public humiliation and emotional devastation, embarked on a pattern that would define her life: the immediate, desperate search for a new man to fill the void left by the last. It was a frantic, almost compulsive attempt to outrun her own pain, and the next candidate stepped onto the stage with an air of continental sophistication that must have seemed like a welcome contrast to her first husband's brazen opportunism. His name was Count Kurt von Haugwitz Reventhow, a Danish nobleman whose title, while authentic, came with a cloud of suspicion regarding its true prestige, and was wielded by a man with a notoriously controlling and difficult personality. To a wounded Barbara, however, he represented something she craved even more than romantic love after the Mdivani fiasco, a sense of order, stability, and legitimate European respectability. Their courtship was swift and intense, a whirlwind that swept Barbara off her feet just months after her first marriage ended. For a woman whose sense of self-worth had been shattered, the focused, authoritative attention of a count, a real one this time, offered a powerful antidote to her insecurity. Mdivani had been a flamboyant spender. Reventlow presented himself as a man of discipline and old-world propriety. He seemed to offer not just a title, but a structured life, a place within the rigid hierarchy of European aristocracy that promised to finally provide the security and defined role her chaotic American upbringing had lacked. They were married in a quiet ceremony in New York in the summer of 1935, a mere year after her divorce was finalized. This rapid remarriage was less a testament to finding true love and more a glaring indication of her profound emotional fragility and her unwavering belief that salvation lay in the arms of a powerful, titled man. Almost from the beginning of their life together, the Count's true nature began to reveal itself. The man who had promised structure and stability quickly morphed into a domineering and often cruel husband. He exhibited a powerful need to control every aspect of Barbara's life, from her friendships and social engagements to her personal spending habits. He systematically worked to isolate her from what few genuine friends she had, criticizing them and casting doubt on their motives, ensuring that he remained her sole confidant and gatekeeper to the outside world. This isolation was a classic tactic of a controller, and for Barbara, whose childhood had been a masterclass in loneliness, it was a familiar, if painful, trap. He frequently belittled her in public, making cutting remarks about her intelligence or her appearance, further eroding the fragile self-esteem she was trying to rebuild. The marriage became a gilded prison, with Reventlow acting as both warden and critic. It was into this tense and oppressive environment that Barbara's only child, Lance Reventlow, was born in 1936. One might have hoped that motherhood would provide Barbara with a new sense of purpose and an unconditional love she had always craved. Tragically, her own emotional deficits and the toxicity of her marriage made it nearly impossible for her to be the mother she likely wanted to be. She was often physically absent, continuing her pattern of globetrotting, and when she was present, she was emotionally distant, replicating the very parenting style she had suffered under. Her relationship with Lance was further complicated by her overwhelming guilt. She showered him with extravagant gifts and material luxuries, just as her father had done with her, substituting presents for presents and attempting to buy a love she didn't know how to earn. This cycle of neglect and guilt-driven overindulgence would shape Lance's own troubled life, creating a heartbreaking echo of the very loneliness that had plagued his mother since her own childhood. The birth of her son did nothing to salvage the disintegrating marriage. If anything, it heightened the tensions. Count Reventlow's controlling behavior only intensified, and the relationship became a cold war of quiet resentment played out in luxurious settings across Europe. The fairy tale of finding a stable, respectable life within the European aristocracy had proven to be yet another illusion, this one more psychologically damaging than the first. Her second husband had not been a charming fortune hunter like Mdivani, but something potentially more destructive. A man who sought not just to spend her money, but to dominate her spirit and systematically dismantle what little confidence she had left. By the time this marriage too ended in divorce in 1941, Barbara was not just wealthier and lonelier. She was profoundly more damaged. Her search for love now twisted into a desperate need for validation from men who were increasingly incapable of providing it. From the outside, her new life as Countess von Haugwitz-Reventhe was a vision of European opulence that few could even dream of. She and the Count divided their time between a spectacular palace in the heart of Rome, an immense country estate in the verdant Danish countryside, and a sprawling, sun-drenched villa overlooking the Mediterranean in the south of France. Each residence was a monument to wealth, filled with priceless old master paintings, museum-quality antique furniture, and legions of servants who moved with silent efficiency to meet their every whim. Their social calendar was a relentless whirl of the most exclusive parties, lavish costume balls, and intimate dinners with the crowned heads of Europe, Hollywood stars, and the dwindling remnants of the international aristocracy. In the gilded salons of Paris and on the sun-drenched decks of private yachts, Barbara was the undisputed queen, a figure of fascination and envy, always impeccably dressed and adorned with some of the most magnificent jewels ever privately owned. Yet, within the echoing halls of these palatial homes, a very different reality festered. The man who escorted her so proudly in public became a critical and domineering figure in private. Count Reventhau's resentment towards his wife seemed to grow in direct proportion to her fame and fortune. He was frequently heard making cutting, humiliating remarks about her, criticizing her intelligence, her taste, and even her appearance, systematically tearing down the fragile confidence she had left. This verbal abuse was a constant, corrosive presence in her life, a daily reminder that even with a royal title and limitless wealth, she was still failing to earn the respect and affection of the man she had married. The glamorous society they moved in became a stage for his subtle cruelties, leaving Barbara feeling perpetually on edge, performing the role of a happy countess while her spirit was being systematically dismantled behind the scenes. This internal misery was compounded by the Count's palpable and deeply troubling resentment towards their young son, Lance. Reventhe saw the boy not as a child to be cherished, but as a rival for Barbara's attention, and more significantly, as a direct threat to his own financial and social standing. He was cold and distant with the boy, often excluding him from family activities and making it clear that Lance was an unwelcome complication in their lives. For Barbara, who understood all too well the pain of a neglected childhood, this situation was a source of profound conflict and guilt. She was torn between her fear of confronting her domineering husband and her deep, instinctual desire to protect her son. Often, she chose the path of least resistance, retreating from the conflict and leaving Lance in the care of nannies, thereby repeating the very cycle of maternal absence that had defined her own youth and cementing a lonely, isolated upbringing for her only child. It was in this pressure cooker of marital misery and maternal guilt that Barbara first began to rely on chemical crutches to navigate her days. To get through the endless, tense social obligations, she turned to alcohol, finding a fleeting sense of confidence and numbness in champagne and cocktails. To cope with the insomnia and anxiety that plagued her in the quiet, lonely hours, she began taking prescription sedatives and sleeping pills. What started as a manageable habit soon escalated into a dangerous dependency. The pills helped her sleep, and the alcohol helped her face the world, creating a vicious cycle that her personal physicians, ever eager to please their wealthy patron, were all too willing to enable by freely writing prescriptions. This reliance on substances was a desperate attempt to self-medicate a profound and untreated emotional pain, a way to dull the sharp edges of a reality that, for all its external glitter, had become utterly unbearable. This coping mechanism, born in the gloom of her second marriage, would solidify into a lifelong addiction, a shadow that would lengthen and darken with each passing year and every subsequent heartbreak. The end of her second marriage was not a clean break, but a protracted and deeply acrimonious legal battle that dragged on for years, stripping away any last remnants of dignity and privacy. The divorce from Count Kurt von Haugwitz-Riebenthau was finalized in 1938, but the process had been a war of attrition, fought through teams of high-priced lawyers in multiple countries. Unlike her divorce from Mdivani, which had the air of a financial transaction, the split from Riebenthau was profoundly personal and bitter. He contested the proceedings fiercely, using every legal maneuver to extract the maximum possible financial concession, turning their failed union into a brutal negotiation over the price of her freedom. The final settlement was staggering: to sever ties with the man who had controlled and criticized her for years. Barbara was forced to hand over a settlement reported to be in the millions, including a significant lump sum cash payment and valuable properties. It was a devastating financial drain, far exceeding the cost of her first divorce and establishing a terrifying pattern. Each failed marriage was not just an emotional catastrophe, but a raid on the very foundation of her wealth. Beyond the immense financial hemorrhage, the divorce inflicted profound damage on her already fragile public reputation. The scandalous details of the Count's controlling behavior and their toxic private life spilled from the legal documents into the eager hands of the international press. The newspapers that had once portrayed her as a fairy tale princess now painted her as a tragic, almost pitiable figure, a woman incapable of holding a man's love despite her unimaginable fortune. The poor little rich girl narrative was now firmly cemented in the public consciousness, but it had taken on a darker, more cynical tone. She was becoming a cautionary tale, a source of morbid fascination rather than aspirational envy. This public shaming deepened her sense of isolation, making her retreat further behind the high walls of her estates and the protective shell of her wealth, trusting fewer and fewer people as she moved through the world. The psychological toll of this second, profoundly damaging failure was immeasurable. Where the Mdivani divorce had confirmed her fear of being unloved, the Riebenthau divorce seemed to confirm something even worse: that she was inherently flawed, weak, and unworthy of basic respect. The Count's relentless belittlement had wormed its way into her psyche, leaving behind a deep-seated conviction that his criticisms were true. She was left more disillusioned and vulnerable than ever before, her self-esteem in tatters. The frantic search for a stable, respectable identity through a titled husband had backfired spectacularly, leaving her with nothing but a costly legal document and a profound sense of hopelessness. This period marked a critical turning point in her reliance on artificial comforts. Her use of alcohol and prescription pills, once a coping mechanism, began to escalate into a more serious dependency, a chemical fortress she built around herself to numb the constant ache of failure and loneliness. As the world moved toward the global cataclysm of World War II, Barbara Hutton, one of the planet's wealthiest women, was adrift, emotionally bankrupt, spiritually exhausted, and utterly unprepared for the tumultuous decade that lay ahead. Emerging from the wreckage of 2 disastrous marriages and a bitterly expensive divorce, Barbara Hutton's life seemed to be in a state of permanent emotional freefall. Yet, in the early 1940s, a new figure entered her world who appeared to be fundamentally different from the fortune-hunting princes and controlling counts of her past. This was Cary Grant, one of Hollywood's most beloved and charismatic leading men, a star whose effortless charm on screen was matched by a complex and searching personality off of it. Their union would become the most famous of her 7 marriages, a pairing that captivated the global imagination and offered, for a fleeting moment, the tantalizing possibility of a love story that could finally transcend the burdens of her fortune. Here was a man who, by all appearances, didn't need her money. He was a self-made millionaire in his own right, a box office titan at the peak of his fame. For the first time, Barbara could entertain the hope that a suitor was drawn to her for who she was, not for the astronomical number attached to her name. The public's fascination with the Cash and Carey marriage, as the press wryly dubbed it, was immediate and insatiable. It was the ultimate celebrity merger, a story that wrote its own headlines, the world's richest woman wedding one of its most desirable bachelors. The gossip columns portrayed it as a fairy tale for the modern age, a narrative of 2 dazzling, seemingly perfect lives colliding in a shower of sparkle and glamour. They were the ultimate power couple, photographed at film premieres, elegant nightclubs, and lavish parties, always smiling, always the picture of sophisticated bliss. This relationship offered Barbara a new kind of public identity. She was no longer just the tragic heiress or the failed countess, but the wife of a genuine American icon, a role that brought her a level of mainstream admiration and acceptance she had never before experienced. Their courtship, which began in earnest in the months leading up to their wedding in July of 1942, possessed a quality of whirlwind intensity that felt different from her previous entanglements. There was a palpable sense of mutual attraction and a shared understanding of the peculiar pressures of living life in the spotlight. Both were survivors of difficult childhoods, and both understood the performative nature of fame. In Carey, Barbara found a companion who could navigate the flashbulbs and autograph seekers with practiced ease. A man who could, in theory, protect her from the very scrutiny he himself had mastered. He offered her a glimpse of something she had always craved, but never found in her palatial European residences: a semblance of normal domestic companionship. They spent quiet evenings at home, socialized with his circle of Hollywood friends, and for a short while, Barbara allowed herself to believe that she could have a life that was not defined solely by her wealth, but by a shared partnership with a man she genuinely admired. But beneath the dazzling surface of Hollywood's most glamorous couple, tensions were simmering that would ultimately prove far more powerful than the camera's flash. The first crack in the facade was the significant age gap. Cary Grant was 38, a mature, established man who had fought his way up from a poverty-stricken childhood in Bristol, England, while Barbara was just 30, a woman who had never known a single day of financial want. This wasn't just a difference in years. It was a fundamental chasm in their lived experiences. He was a self-made man who understood the value of a dollar and the discipline required to build a career from nothing. She was the ultimate product of inherited wealth, for whom spending was as natural as breathing, a reflex to soothe any discomfort. This divergence in their very core identities created a subtle but persistent friction that no amount of public adoration could smooth over. His background as a former acrobat who had remade himself into a screen legend meant he valued hard work, punctuality, and professional dedication. Her world was one of unstructured leisure, grand tours, and a staff that anticipated her every whim. Carrie's career demanded that he be in Hollywood, on set, and focused on his craft. Barbara's life was one of restless movement, a perpetual tourist with no fixed schedule or professional obligations. He was building an empire, she was spending one. This clash of lifestyles became a source of quiet resentment. He reportedly grew frustrated with her inability to understand the pressures of his work, while she felt neglected when his career inevitably took precedence over her endless need for attention and diversion. The very independence and self-reliance that made Carrie so attractive to her were the same qualities that left her feeling lonely and abandoned when he turned his focus to his own ambitions. Her spending habits, which had always been extravagant, became a particular point of contention. For Carrie, who was meticulously managing his own hard-earned fortune, Barbara's casual acquisition of yet another palace, another suite of jewels, or another fleet of custom-designed cars was not just bewildering. It was deeply unsettling. It represented a world he could not comprehend, a bottomless pit of consumption that seemed to have no purpose other than to momentarily fill an emotional void. He made attempts to curb her expenditures, to introduce some semblance of financial discipline, but these efforts were perceived by Barbara not as concern, but as criticism and control, echoing the painful dynamics of her marriage to Reventhow. Each attempt to manage her spending felt like a rejection of her very being, a confirmation that he, too, failed to understand the profound emptiness that the money was meant to assuage. Most heartbreakingly, Cary Grant was perhaps the first of her husbands to genuinely see the depth of her psychological turmoil and her growing dependency on pills and alcohol. He recognized that her lavish spending and frantic socializing were symptoms of a much deeper sickness of the soul. Unlike her previous husbands, he did not exploit her vulnerabilities. He tried to cure them. He encouraged her to seek professional psychiatric help, a radical and forward-thinking suggestion for the era. He made earnest efforts to engage her in a more grounded, domestic life, hoping that simplicity and stability could provide the peace that luxury had so clearly failed to deliver. He saw the wounded child inside the wealthy woman and, for a time, truly believed he could help her heal. Yet, his efforts were ultimately futile. Barbara's addictions and emotional needs were too deeply entrenched, woven into the very fabric of her identity since childhood. Her reliance on prescription medication to sleep and alcohol to socialize had become a non-negotiable part of her daily survival. When Grant tried to intervene, limiting her access to pills or urging sobriety, he was met not with gratitude, but with resistance and resentment. To Barbara, these substances were her only reliable companions, the only things that could numb the chronic pain of her existence. His well-intentioned attempts to take them away felt like a profound threat, an assault on her primary coping mechanisms. She could not or would not confront the depth of her illness, and his love, however genuine, was not enough to break the powerful grip of her addiction. The man who had charmed millions on screen found himself powerless in the face of his own wife's profound unhappiness, a helpless witness to a tragedy he could not rewrite. The global cataclysm of World War II did not merely reshape borders and topple empires. It also applied immense external pressure to the already fragile foundation of Barbara and Carrie's marriage, forcing them into separate orbits that would never fully realign. While Cary Grant threw himself into the Allied war effort with a characteristic sense of duty, Barbara Hutton, unmoored from any sense of purposeful routine, continued her restless wanderings, and the chasm between their lives grew from a subtle crack into an unbridgeable divide. Grant was deeply involved in fundraising activities, performing for troops, and using his considerable star power to sell war bonds, a commitment that gave his life a gravity and direction that resonated with his own self-made character. This work demanded his full attention, often pulling him away for long stretches and immersing him in a world of collective sacrifice and national purpose that Barbara, with her nomadic and insulated existence, could not easily access or understand. Meanwhile, Barbara's own wartime activities, though often well-intentioned, underscored their fundamental differences. She continued her life of transatlantic travel, albeit with new difficulties, moving between her various estates and making headlines with grand, symbolic gestures of support. The most telling of these was her donation of the magnificent 200-foot yacht, which she had named the Pioneer, to the British Navy. It was a genuinely patriotic act, a substantial gift from an American heiress to a nation fighting for its survival, and it was rightly praised in the press. Yet, on a deeply personal level, the gesture was profoundly symbolic of the drifting apart of their lives. The Pioneer had been a vessel for their glamorous pre-war life together, a floating palace for Mediterranean cruises and sun-drenched escapes. Handing it over to be converted for military use was like surrendering the last relic of their shared fantasy, a tangible admission that the era of carefree, luxurious pleasure sailing was over, replaced by the grim realities of a world at war. For Cary, a man who valued tangible contribution, his wife's grand but somewhat abstract philanthropy may have seemed like a poor substitute for the hands-on work he was doing. While he was on a stage shaking hands with soldiers and convincing ordinary citizens to invest their savings in the fight, she was writing checks from a distance, a method of engagement that perfectly suited her isolated, rarefied world, but did little to foster a sense of shared struggle. He was in the thick of the collective American experience, while she remained aloof in her bubble of extreme privilege, observing the conflict from the balconies of five-star hotels and the drawing rooms of her secluded villas. This disparity in their engagement with the war effort highlighted the core disconnect in their values. He was fundamentally a man of the people, and she was permanently, inescapably, a woman apart from them. This period of physical separation and emotional divergence marked the true beginning of the end for their relationship. The intense, focused courtship in the early months of married life had been a brilliant, temporary flare, but it could not sustain itself under the weight of global conflict and their own ingrained natures. The man who had seemed like a strong, stable anchor now felt like a distant and disapproving figure, constantly working and criticizing her lifestyle. The woman he had seen as a wounded soul in need of rescue now appeared to be a perpetual patient, unwilling to do the hard work of healing and increasingly reliant on the very substances he despised. The war, with its enforced distances and its demand for seriousness, stripped away the glamorous facade of their union, revealing two people who were not just incompatible, but who were actively traveling down paths that led in opposite directions. The shared understanding they had once enjoyed evaporated, replaced by a wearying cycle of brief reunions, tense disagreements, and the slow, painful realization that their fairy tale marriage was just another beautiful illusion. The final unraveling of her marriage to Cary Grant was not a dramatic, headline-grabbing explosion, but a slow, quiet dissolution, like a beautiful piece of fabric fraying at the edges until nothing cohesive remained. By 1945, the war was ending, but the peace did not extend to their home. The fundamental incompatibilities that had been papered over by initial passion and the distractions of global conflict now stood exposed in the harsh light of everyday life. Grant's patience with her escalating dependency on pills and alcohol had worn thin, and his attempts to steer her towards stability were met with increasing resistance. Her profound loneliness, which he could not cure, and his own career ambitions, which she felt neglected her, created a stalemate. They were two stars from different constellations, briefly aligned but destined to drift apart according to their own unique gravitational pulls. The divorce, when it came, was a quiet, almost anticlimactic affair, finalized in the summer of 1945, closing the book on what had been the most publicly celebrated and personally devastating relationship of her life. What made this divorce uniquely painful, cutting far deeper than the splits from Mdivani or Reventhow, was the stark absence of a financial motive. Cary Grant walked away from the marriage asking for nothing. He did not demand a cash settlement. He did not sue for alimony, and he did not lay claim to any of her properties or jewels. For a woman whose entire adult life had been a parade of men drawn to the glow of her fortune, this was a confounding and ultimately devastating reality. With her previous husbands, the bitter ending had a clear, transactional quality. She was paying a price to be free of a bad investment, but with Cary, there was no bill to pay. His refusal to take a single dime from her was a silent, powerful indictment that shattered the narrative she had come to rely on. It forced her to confront a truth more terrible than any financial loss. This man, whom she genuinely loved and admired, was leaving not because he wanted her money, but because he simply did not want her. The relationship had failed on purely emotional grounds, and for Barbara, that was the most painful bankruptcy of all. In the bleak aftermath, Barbara's own public and private statements revealed a depth of regret she never expressed about any other relationship. While she would often speak of her marriages with a kind of detached, worldly cynicism, her references to Cary Grant were tinged with a palpable and enduring sorrow. She was quoted as saying that he was the one man she truly loved, and that theirs was the one marriage she desperately wished had endured. These weren't the calculated remarks of a society figure. They were the raw admissions of a woman who had glimpsed a potential path to happiness, only to see it vanish because of her own unhealed wounds and insecurities. The failure with Grant was a referendum on her own ability to be loved and to sustain love, and the verdict felt absolute. He had represented a chance at a normal life, a partnership of equals, a love story untarnished by greed. That she had been unable to hold on to it, despite his genuine efforts, confirmed her deepest fear, that the poor little rich girl was, at her core, simply poor in the ways that mattered most. This profound sense of loss sent her spiraling into a new, darker phase of her life. If a man like Cary Grant, with his own wealth, fame, and initial devotion, could not save her, then what hope remained? The experience seemed to extinguish the last flicker of her belief that she could find salvation in another person. The divorce left her more isolated and adrift than ever, and in response, she plunged headlong into the only comforts that never judged her and never asked her to change: her pills, her alcohol, and the frantic, endless pursuit of new distractions in the arms of new men. The end of her Hollywood dream was not just the end of a marriage. It was the collapse of her most credible chance at redemption, leaving behind a void that would soon be filled by a series of even more transient and ultimately damaging relationships. Yet before the echo of that Hollywood heartbreak had even faded, Barbara Hutton was already racing toward the next illusion of rescue, this time in the form of a man who embodied speed, risk, and a romanticized European past. His name was Prince Igor Trubetskoy, a dashing white Russian émigré whose life story seemed lifted from the pages of a swashbuckling novel. He was a genuine prince from a distinguished family that had lost everything during the Bolshevik Revolution, a man who had forged a new identity not in boardrooms or drawing rooms, but on the perilous curves of the Grand Prix racing circuit. As a successful and famously handsome racing driver, Trubetskoy represented a thrilling combination of old-world aristocracy and modern, death-defying glamour. He was the antithesis of everything Cary Grant had been. Where Grant was Hollywood stability and psychological complexity, Trubetskoy was pure, undiluted adrenaline, a charming, charismatic force of nature who promised not a quiet domestic life, but a continuous, exhilarating escape. Their meeting was the stuff of high society fantasy, a collision of two glittering worlds at a glamorous party in Paris. For Barbara, still raw and reeling from the emotional fallout of her divorce, the prince's whirlwind attention must have felt like a potent antidote to her pain. He didn't want to talk about her feelings or curtail her spending. He swept her into his fast-paced, high-stakes world of international races, glittering casinos, and a circle of equally daring and wealthy jet-setters. The courtship was breathtakingly swift, a blur of exotic locations and intense romantic gestures that left no room for sober reflection. Within a matter of months, in the summer of 1947, they were married in a civil ceremony in Lausanne, Switzerland. The press, ever eager for the next chapter in the Hutton saga, portrayed it as another dazzling romance, the lonely heiress finding passion and purpose with a royal adventurer. On the surface, this fourth marriage offered Barbara everything she thought she wanted. The title of Princess Trubetskoy provided another layer of European legitimacy, a new identity to try on after the failure of her previous roles as a movie star's wife and a Danish countess. More importantly, the lifestyle Igor represented was a powerful distraction. The constant travel from one Grand Prix to the next, the thrill of the race, the collective gasp of the crowds, it all served as a perfect anesthetic, drowning out the internal whispers of inadequacy and regret with a roaring symphony of external stimulation. In this world, there was no time to dwell on the past or contemplate the future. There was only the next party, the next race, the next destination. For a woman desperate to outrun her own unhappiness, Prince Igor Trubetskoy and his world of speed seemed like the perfect vehicle. But a relationship built on the foundation of shared distraction is inherently fragile, incapable of weathering the slightest moment of stillness or adversity. The fundamental instability of this union became starkly apparent almost the moment the whirlwind died down. The very qualities that made Igor so exciting, his risk-taking, his nomadic existence, his focus on his own dangerous career, made him a profoundly unreliable life partner for a woman with Barbara's profound emotional need. He was a man of action, not introspection, a companion for adventure, not a caretaker for a wounded soul. As the initial rush of the romance began to subside, the old patterns reasserted themselves. Barbara's reliance on alcohol and pills to manage her anxiety and insomnia continued unabated, and the prince, absorbed in his own world, was neither equipped nor inclined to deal with the messy reality of her deepening addiction. The marriage lasted a mere 52 days, a stunningly brief period, even by Barbara Hutton's already chaotic standards. Its collapse was as swift and decisive as its beginning. The specific incident that triggered the final split was a violent, alcohol-fueled argument, after which Igor Trubetskoy simply walked out, leaving the marriage as abruptly as he had entered it. The public reason given was the familiar refrain of irreconcilable differences, but privately, it was clear the prince had no interest in being the full-time custodian of a deeply troubled woman. He had signed on for a glamorous adventure, not a long-term rehabilitation project. The divorce was finalized with a swiftness that underscored its utter lack of substance, leaving Barbara with little more than another line on her marital resume and another hefty legal bill. This fourth, spectacularly short-lived marriage stands as a glaring red flag in the narrative of Barbara Hutton's life, a clear and undeniable sign of her increasingly desperate and impulsive decision-making. The union with Trubetskoy was not a search for love or companionship in any mature sense. It was a frantic, almost pathological attempt to flee from herself. She was no longer looking for a husband. She was looking for a vehicle, a distraction powerful enough to silence the growing despair within her. The 52-day duration of the marriage proved that the glittering facade of a title and an exciting lifestyle could no longer sustain her for even 2 months. Each successive failure was stripping away a layer of her resilience, pushing her further toward the edge and cementing her reputation not as a tragic figure worthy of sympathy, but as a reckless, almost absurd serial bride, a wealthy woman burning through husbands with the same casual disregard she showed for her fortune. The 52-day marriage to Prince Igor Trubetskoy didn't just end. It evaporated in a cloud of scandal and humiliation, leaving behind a trail of whispers that echoed through every society column in Europe and America. The official story, the one presented to the press, was a sterile declaration of irreconcilable differences, a phrase that had become a tired refrain in Barbara Hutton's life. But behind the scenes, the rumors swirled with far more dramatic specifics. Whispers of the prince's infidelity began almost immediately, with gossip alleging he had barely paused his romantic pursuits after saying, "I do." Other accounts pointed to a violent, alcohol-fueled confrontation that served as the final, explosive break. A clash so severe it prompted the prince to simply walk out and never look back. The most cutting rumor of all suggested that Igor, a man who faced down death on the racetrack with cool courage, was simply terrified by the profound depth of Barbara's psychological turmoil and addiction, finding the reality of her neediness far more frightening than any hairpin turn. This public implosion was more than just another failed relationship. It was a spectacular blow to whatever remained of her social credibility. A marriage lasting less than 2 months was not a tragedy. It was a farce, and Barbara became the punchline. The press, which had once chronicled her life with a mix of awe and pity, now treated her with open ridicule. Headlines mocked the 52-day folly, and cartoonists depicted her as a hopelessly frivolous woman collecting husbands like others collected hats. This wasn't the complex tragedy of the poor little rich girl anymore. It was being framed as a spectacle of sheer incompetence and poor judgment. The annulment, a legal mechanism to erase the marriage as if it had never happened, felt like a desperate attempt to undo a very public, very expensive mistake. But the stain on her reputation was permanent. What this fleeting disaster revealed about Barbara's emotional state was both stark and heartbreaking. Her rush into the arms of a charismatic adventurer so soon after the profound disappointment with Cary Grant was not a search for love, but a full-blown flight from herself. She was no longer trying to build a life with a partner. She was trying to outrun the crippling loneliness and self-loathing that consumed her when she was alone. The Trubetskoy marriage was the ultimate proof that no external stimulus, not a title, not a thrilling lifestyle, not even a handsome prince could provide a lasting anesthetic for her internal pain. It showed a woman whose judgment was utterly clouded by desperation, a person so lost that she would cling to any passing fantasy if it promised even a moment's respite from the emptiness. Financially, the annulment came with yet another steep price tag, continuing the devastating pattern where every romantic failure resulted in a direct withdrawal from her fortune. While the settlement with Trubetskoy was likely smaller than those paid to Mdivani or Reventhow, it was one more leak in a financial ship that was already taking on water at an alarming rate. More importantly, it solidified a dangerous precedent in the minds of potential suitors. A marriage to Barbara Hutton, no matter how brief, was a guaranteed payout. She had effectively turned herself into the most lucrative short-term contract in the world, ensuring that future husbands would see her not as a lifelong companion, but as a temporary, highly profitable venture. The Trubetskoy annulment was the point where her quest for love fully devolved into a transactional cycle of pursuit and payoff, stripping away the last vestiges of romantic pretense and revealing a heartbreaking truth. She was now primarily a business opportunity for the men she allowed into her life. In the chaotic wake of her 52-day marriage to a racing prince, Barbara Hutton's life might have seemed like a spectacle spiraling beyond control, yet her next romantic choice would stun the world with its sheer improbability. Rather than pursuing another flamboyant aristocrat, she turned her attention to a man whose fame was forged not on a royal pedigree, but on the manicured lawns of the Tennis World Championship circuit. His name was Gottfried von Cramm, a German baron and one of the most celebrated tennis players of his era, a man known as much for his impeccable sportsmanship and elegant backhand as for a personal history shadowed by profound political trauma. This union was a dramatic departure from her previous patterns, presenting a relationship built not on escapism, but on a shared experience of public suffering and the compelling narrative of rescue. Von Cramm's story was one of courage and tragedy. A 3-time Wimbledon finalist and a national hero in Germany, he had been a vocal critic of the Nazi regime, a dangerous stance that led to his arrest in 1938 on fabricated morals charges, an accusation widely believed to be politically motivated punishment for his defiance. He was tried, convicted, and spent a year imprisoned, an experience that shattered his career and left him a pariah in his own country. By the time he re-emerged into international society after the war, von Cramm was a figure of sympathy and admiration, a man who had stood on principle and paid a terrible personal price. For Barbara, who had always felt like a victim of her own fortune, here was a man who was a genuine victim of a brutal political system, a real-life hero who had lost everything for his beliefs. This context ignited a powerful new dynamic in Barbara's quest for purpose. After failing to find happiness as a princess, a countess, or a movie star's wife, she now cast herself in the role of a savior. In Gottfried von Cramm, she saw a noble man brought low, a champion in need of redemption, and she possessed the one thing that could orchestrate his comeback: her vast wealth and social influence. She reportedly financed his return to the tennis circuit, using her connections to smooth his re-entry into the international sporting world that had once revered him. This was not the frantic distraction she had sought with Trubetskoy. This felt like a mission, a relationship with a higher calling. For perhaps the first time, her money was being deployed not for her own pleasure or insulation, but to actively restore the life and dignity of another person. It offered her a potent, intoxicating sense of usefulness that her aimless luxury had never provided. They were married in a quiet civil ceremony in Switzerland in the summer of 1955, and on the surface, it appeared to be a partnership of profound mutual need. He gained a patron and a passport back into the global elite, while she gained a project and a partner whose moral stature was unimpeachable. The press and public were largely sympathetic, viewing the match as a poignant second chance for two damaged icons. Barbara, who had so often been portrayed as frivolous and self-destructive, was now seen in a more compassionate light, the wealthy angel who had come to the aid of a fallen hero. It was a narrative she eagerly embraced, a chance to rewrite her own story from that of a tragic heiress to a benevolent benefactor. Yet, beneath this uplifting surface, the relationship was complicated by a persistent and widely circulated rumor within European social circles that Gottfried von Cramm was homosexual. This was the same charge the Nazis had used to imprison him, and while its use as a political weapon made its truth difficult to discern, the whispers endured. If true, it added a layer of profound complexity to their union. For Barbara, it raised the question of whether this marriage was truly about romantic love, or whether it was, like so many others, a transaction, a mutually beneficial arrangement where she provided financial and social rehabilitation in exchange for the appearance of a stable, respectable partnership with a man of impeccable character. It could be seen as her most sophisticated attempt yet to find a purpose through a man, choosing one whose very victimhood allowed her to play the redeemer, a role that offered a powerful, if fleeting, antidote to her own feelings of worthlessness. The marriage lasted just over 2 years, ending in divorce in 1957. Its dissolution was quiet and civil, a stark contrast to the bitter battles of her past. There were no public scandals, no accusations of infidelity or financial demands. The two remained on polite terms, suggesting a relationship that had run its course rather than one that exploded in betrayal. The end of this union carried a unique kind of poignancy. While her marriage to Cary Grant had failed for lack of compatibility, and her marriage to Trubetskoy for lack of substance, the failure with von Kram suggested a failure of a narrative itself. The story of the heiress saving the champion had a beginning and a middle, but it could not sustain a lifelong conclusion. The role of savior, like the roles of princess or movie star wife, was ultimately another part to play, another external identity that could not permanently quiet the internal turmoil. It proved that even the most noble of intentions, when rooted in a need to fill one's own emptiness, could not create a foundation for lasting happiness. Their marriage, for all its good intentions, existed within a peculiar and emotionally ambiguous space, functioning more as a deep, mutually respectful friendship than a passionate or even conventionally romantic union. Friends and observers noted a distinct lack of the dramatic tension that had defined her previous relationships. There were no public arguments, no accusations of infidelity, no flagrant displays of jealousy or control. Instead, they presented a united front of quiet companionship, often seen strolling through the gardens of her estates or attending charitable events together, always polite, always supportive. This partnership offered Barbara a kind of peace she had rarely known, a respite from the tumultuous betrayals and emotional hurricanes of her past. Gottfried, for his part, was a gentleman of the old school, gracious and consistently kind, treating her with a deference and stability that felt safe after so many years of chaos. Yet, this very safety and lack of conflict highlighted the relationship's core deficiency. It was a sanctuary, but not a source of the deep, soul-stirring intimacy she had spent her whole life pursuing. This arrangement, while comfortable, ultimately underscored the profound loneliness that her fortune could never alleviate. The absence of scandal was a welcome relief, but it was purchased at the price of genuine emotional and physical closeness. Barbara, who craved to be desired and cherished in a way that transcended friendship or financial support, found herself in yet another gilded cage, this one padded with kindness, but just as confining. The whispered rumors about von Kram's sexuality, whether true or not, created an unspoken barrier between them, a tacit understanding that certain depths of connection would remain unexplored. For a woman whose self-worth was so tied to being loved romantically, this platonic partnership, however dignified, could only be perceived as another form of rejection. It quietly confirmed her fear that she was incapable of inspiring the kind of all-consuming passion she saw in films and read about in books, leaving her to play the role of a generous patron rather than a beloved wife. Their divorce in 1951, while notably amicable, carried the weight of a quiet, resigned failure. There were no bitter legal battles over money, no sensational headlines detailing salacious accusations. The separation was handled with the same grace and discretion that had characterized their entire marriage, a civil agreement between two people who had simply reached the end of their shared road. Gottfried von Cramm moved on with his life, eventually remarrying and finding a more conventional happiness, while Barbara was left once more with the echoing silence of her own company. The end of this union was arguably more devastating than the explosive collapses of her past because its failure was so subtle and unimpeachable. There was no villain to blame, no dramatic betrayal to point to as the cause. The marriage simply hadn't worked because it could not provide the fundamental emotional nourishment she needed to survive. It was a relationship that had promised purpose and stability, but had delivered only a more refined and therefore more confusing kind of loneliness. This sixth marital failure marked a critical point of no return in Barbara's psychological descent. If a partnership with a man as universally admired and fundamentally decent as Gottfried von Cramm could not bring her happiness, then what possible path remained? The von Cramm enigma proved that even a good man, a kind man, a man of principle, could not heal the wounds inflicted in her childhood. It demonstrated with brutal clarity that the void within her was not something another person could fill, no matter how noble their character or how generous her financial support. The amicable nature of the divorce offered no comfort. In fact, its civility made the underlying tragedy all the more profound. She had exhausted another archetype, the redeemed hero, and found it as hollow as the fortune-hunting prince and the controlling count. Each departed husband left behind a piece of her fortune and a larger piece of her hope, until very little of either remained. If the union with Gottfried von Cramm represented a quiet, dignified friendship, her next marriage would be its polar opposite, a supernova of scandal, extravagance, and raw, unapologetic seduction. Enter Porfirio Rubirosa, the legendary Dominican diplomat and international playboy, whose very name was synonymous with masculine charm, daredevil charisma, and a career dedicated to the romantic pursuit of the world's wealthiest women. Where von Cramm was a gentleman athlete, Rubirosa was a force of nature, a man whose legendary prowess on the polo field was matched only by his reputation in the bedrooms and nightclubs of 4 continents. He was the ultimate gigolo, a professional charmer who moved through high society with a single-minded goal: to marry and subsequently divorce spectacularly rich heiresses, securing his own luxurious lifestyle through pre-negotiated settlements. For a woman whose life had become a cycle of transactional relationships, Rubirosa was the most honest and formidable predator she would ever encounter. Their affair ignited with the intensity of a tropical storm, a whirlwind of passion played out under the relentless flash of paparazzi cameras. They met in the glamorous playgrounds of Paris and New York, and the chemistry was immediate and volcanic. For Barbara, still reeling from the quiet failure of her marriage to von Cramm, the raw animal magnetism of Rubirosa was a powerful and irresistible shock to the system. He offered no pretense of wanting to save her or build a stable life. He offered pure, unadulterated excitement and a kind of intense, focused attention that made her feel, for a fleeting moment, like the most desirable woman in the world. He was a master of the grand gesture, an expert in the art of making a woman feel like the center of his universe. And for a soul as starved for validation as Barbara's, his technique was devastatingly effective. Their relationship was a constant fixture in the gossip columns, a torrid, headline-grabbing romance that captivated a public both fascinated and appalled by its sheer audacity. The wedding itself, which took place in the Dominican Republic in December of 1953, was a spectacle befitting the couple's notorious reputations. It was orchestrated under the approving eye of the country's dictator, Rafael Trujillo, who was Rubirosa's patron and benefactor, and the event had a distinctly theatrical, almost state-sponsored quality. Barbara, now 41 years old, walked down the aisle to marry a man who was the very embodiment of the fortune hunter she had been warned about since her first marriage 2 decades prior. Yet, in her profound loneliness and desperate need to feel truly wanted, she seemed to willingly suspend all disbelief, plunging headlong into a union that everyone but her could see was a beautifully crafted business arrangement. Rubirosa, for his part, played his role to perfection, the dashing diplomat securing his most lucrative contract to date. The sheer extravagance of their relationship became the stuff of instant legend, even by Barbara Hutton's own lavish standards. While other men had coveted her money, Rubirosa had a unique flair for spending it with a kind of glorious, celebratory excess that felt almost like an art form. The most infamous example was the wedding gift she bestowed upon him, a custom-converted B-25 Mitchell bomber, a World War II-era aircraft that had been transformed into a personal luxury airliner. But this was no ordinary plane. It was a flying testament to excess, famously rumored to be lavishly appointed and even studded with platinum and diamonds. The image of the dashing playboy receiving a bespoke, jewel-encrusted airplane from his new wife perfectly encapsulated the surreal nature of their partnership. It was a gift so over the top, so utterly disconnected from any reality known to ordinary people, that it perfectly symbolized a relationship built not on mutual affection, but on the theatrical performance of wealth and desire. This marriage, however, was doomed from its very first extravagant breath. The intense, passionate fire that had characterized their affair could not sustain a lifelong partnership, especially when one party viewed the relationship as a permanent commitment and the other saw it as a temporary, albeit highly profitable, assignment. Rubirosa's legendary infidelity, which had been an open secret throughout his romantic history, continued unabated. He made little effort to conceal his affairs, treating his marriage to Barbara as little more than a license to spend, while he pursued other interests on the side. The passionate attention he had lavished on her during their courtship swiftly dissipated, replaced by a casual indifference that was more brutally honest than the controlling behavior of Reventhow or the frustrated concern of Cary Grant. For Barbara, the realization was swift and crushing. She had been just another conquest in the little black book of the world's most successful fortune hunter. The legal end of their union arrived with stunning speed. The marriage to Porfirio Rubirosa lasted a mere 73 days, making it only slightly more durable than her 52-day folly with Trubetskoy. The divorce was, like the marriage itself, a financial transaction of epic proportions. The settlement Barbara was required to pay Rubirosa was reported to be a staggering $1 million in cash, a sum that did not even include the value of the famous airplane, the fleet of sports cars, and the other lavish gifts he had already received. This payout cemented Rubirosa's legend and sent an unmistakable message to every other aspirational man in the world. A short-term marriage to Barbara Hutton was the quickest path to unimaginable wealth. The relationship with Rubirosa was the most blatant and costly confirmation of her deepest fears, that her primary value to the world was not her personality, her spirit, or her heart, but the bottomless depth of her bank account, a treasure to be plundered by charming adventurers who saw her not as a person, but as the ultimate prize. Even by the dizzying standards of her previous relationships, the 53-day marriage to Porfirio Rubirosa stands out as a unique spectacle of emotional exploitation and financial plunder. This wasn't a slow-burning disillusionment like her marriage to Cary Grant, nor was it a quiet companionship like her time with Von Cram. This was a hurricane of passion and spending, a supernova of a relationship that burned with blinding intensity before collapsing into a black hole of heartache and financial loss. From the very beginning, Rubirosa made little secret of his intentions, treating his courtship of Barbara not as a romantic pursuit, but as a targeted acquisition. He was a professional charmer, a man whose entire life was a carefully curated performance designed to appeal to the deepest vulnerabilities of extraordinarily wealthy women. For Barbara, who had just emerged from the emotionally sterile partnership with Von Cram, Rubirosa's raw, animal magnetism and his unapologetic focus on her was a potent drug. He made her feel viscerally desired, a sensation she craved more than any title or jewel. And in her profound loneliness, she mistook his expert performance for genuine, all-consuming love. The sheer velocity of their life together was staggering, a relentless whirl of transatlantic flights, late-night parties at Parisian nightclubs, and lavish weekends at his Dominican estate. Rubirosa lived life at full throttle, and he expected Barbara to fund the entire extravagant journey. While previous husbands had spent her money, Rubirosa elevated it to an art form, embarking on a spending spree so audacious it seemed designed to test the very limits of her fortune. The legendary gifts began almost immediately. There was, of course, the converted B-25 bomber, a gift so surreal it perfectly captured the fantasy world they inhabited. But that was just the beginning. He collected a fleet of the fastest sports cars in Europe, each one a custom order. He demanded and received a stable of the finest polo ponies. His appetite for luxury was insatiable, and Barbara, desperate to keep the intense flame of his attention burning, funded every single request. It was as if she was trying to purchase his affection, one outrageous gift at a time, operating under the tragic delusion that the more she spent, the more he would love her. His infidelity was not a hidden vice, but a brazen, integral part of his lifestyle. Rubirosa made no effort to conceal his numerous affairs, often flaunting them in the very social circles he and Barbara frequented. He would disappear for days at a time, offering flimsy excuses about diplomatic business, only to be photographed in the company of another woman at a resort or a racetrack. For Barbara, this public humiliation was a constant, corrosive presence. Each rumor, each grainy newspaper photo was a fresh confirmation of her deepest fear, that she was not enough. The passionate lover who had swept her off her feet was now openly treating her with a casual disregard that was more brutally honest than any previous betrayal. The marriage became a cruel public theater where she played the role of the funding wife while he played the field, a dynamic so transparently transactional that it was visible to everyone but her. The end, when it came after just 53 days, was as swift and clinical as the signing of a business contract. There was no dramatic reconciliation attempt, no tearful pleas for him to change. Rubirosa had achieved his objective. The divorce settlement was one of the most expensive of her life, a multi-million-dollar payout that secured his financial future for decades to come. He walked away with his cash, his airplane, his cars, and his enhanced legend, leaving Barbara with nothing but another stack of legal documents and the hollow echo of a passion that had never been real. This marriage was the ultimate expression of her tragic pattern, stripped of all pretense. With Rubirosa, there was no fantasy of royalty, no dream of domestic stability, no noble mission of rescue. It was a raw exchange, her bottomless need for validation in return for his bottomless capacity to spend her money. The experience didn't just break her heart, it bankrupted her spirit, proving that even the most intense romantic fire could be fueled by the cold, hard currency of exploitation. And so, following the spectacular implosion of her marriage to the ultimate playboy, Barbara Hutton arrived at a moment of profound personal and geographic reckoning. The Western world, with its relentless press scrutiny, its glittering society parties, and its endless parade of fortune hunters, had offered her nothing but heartbreak and humiliation. It was a stage on which she had played every conceivable role: the princess, the countess, the movie star's wife, the savior, the playboy's prize, and each performance had ended in a devastating curtain call. By 1955, the year she turned 43, a deep and understandable weariness had settled upon her. Her solution was not introspection or retreat into solitude, but a final, desperate flight to the other side of the globe, a search for a peace she believed could only be found in total obscurity, far from the judgmental eyes of the society that had made her a spectacle. It was in this context of escape that she encountered her seventh and final husband, Prince Don Vin Na Champasak of Laos. This union was, in many ways, her most transparent attempt to vanish. Laos represented a world apart, a serene and mysterious kingdom nestled in the heart of Southeast Asia, a place where her infamous history might not follow her. Prince Don was a quiet, reserved man from a respected royal family, a figure seemingly removed from the cutthroat glamour of European aristocrats and Latin American adventurers. He appeared to offer a sanctuary, a life of simple, exotic authenticity. To Barbara, exhausted by the emotional carnage of her past, the prospect of becoming a princess in a land of ancient temples and mist-shrouded mountains must have felt like a final, blessed reprieve. Here was a chance to shed the burdensome identity of the poor little rich girl and reinvent herself as a serene Eastern consort, far from the gossip columns that had chronicled her every misstep for decades. Yet, even as she exchanged vows with the Laotian prince, the tragic patterns of her life were not so easily left at the border. The very circumstances that brought them together were drenched in the familiar dynamics of her previous relationships. Barbara was, as ever, the fabulously wealthy Western heiress, and Prince Doan, while of royal blood, was a man whose family's fortunes were modest by her stratospheric standards. The magnetic pull of her fortune, that irresistible force that had drawn every one of her previous husbands, was once again the unspoken engine of the courtship. While their connection may have contained elements of genuine affection, it was impossible to separate from the stark economic reality that she was, yet again, the financial patron in the relationship, a role that had always poisoned the well of trust in her marriages. The promised peace of Laos quickly proved to be another beautiful illusion. The same corrosive issues that had destroyed her marriages in Paris, Rome, and Hollywood quickly took root in the humid air of Southeast Asia. The emotional disconnect was palpable almost from the start. Barbara, a woman whose entire existence had been a performance for an audience, found herself in a land where she did not speak the language and could not comprehend the culture. The profound isolation she had felt in ballrooms and palaces was now magnified in a remote royal compound. She was more alone than ever, a stranger in a strange land, with a husband whose reserved nature and different cultural expectations created a chasm that no amount of goodwill could bridge. The silence between them was not the peaceful quiet she had sought, but a loud, lonely emptiness that echoed the voids of her childhood. Her coping mechanisms, now deeply ingrained after decades of reliance, traveled with her. The drinking and the pills, her constant chemical companions, became her primary method of navigating the days in this new, confusing environment. The frantic spending also continued unabated, a reflexive attempt to furnish her external world with beauty and comfort, since her internal world was in such profound disarray. She poured money into renovating properties and acquiring local treasures, trying to build a home through acquisition, just as she had always tried to build love through financial generosity. But in the context of Laos, her extravagance seemed even more surreal and disjointed, a jarring display of Western wealth in a largely agrarian society, further isolating her from the authentic, simple life she had supposedly come to find. The marriage to Prince Don Vin Champasak lasted 5 years, from 1955 to 1960, making it one of her longer unions, but its duration was a testament more to her exhaustion than to its success. There were no explosive public scandals, no legendary gifts of airplanes, no dramatic walkouts. Instead, the relationship simply faded, like a photograph left in the sun, its colors bleaching out until the image was barely recognizable. The disconnect, the loneliness, and the fundamental lack of a shared language, both literal and emotional, slowly drained the life from the partnership. Its end was a quiet, resigned affair, a mutual acknowledgement that the dream of obscurity and peace had been just that, a dream. With the dissolution of her 7th marriage, the cycle was finally, definitively broken, not because she had found what she was looking for, but because she had run out of new places to look and new princes to believe in. The search was over, leaving behind only the stark and unchanging reality of herself. The dissolution of her 7th and final marriage to Prince Don Vin Champasak in 1960 was not a dramatic, headline-grabbing event, but rather a quiet, almost imperceptible sigh of surrender. After the volcanic passions with Rubirosa and the quiet disappointments with von Kram, this ending felt different. It was the final, definitive closing of a door she had been trying to force open for nearly 3 decades. There were no bitter legal battles over a financial settlement this time, not because the prince was disinterested, but because the seemingly bottomless well of the Woolworth fortune was finally, visibly, running dry. The energy required for another costly divorce simply wasn't there, in her spirit or in her bank accounts. This final separation was less about ending a specific relationship and more about the utter exhaustion of a lifelong, fruitless quest. The search for a man who could finally fill the void was officially over, not because she had found him, but because she had run out of both hope and the physical strength to continue looking. The cumulative financial drain of her 7 marital ventures was nothing short of catastrophic. While the exact figures were shrouded in the complex trusts and holdings of her estate, conservative estimates suggest that over the course of her life, Barbara Hutton paid out tens of millions of dollars in divorce settlements, legal fees, and extravagant gifts to her former husband. To put this in a modern perspective, we are talking about the equivalent of hundreds of millions of today's dollars, systematically transferred from her accounts into the pockets of princes, counts, and playboys. Each marriage had acted like a powerful siphon, with Mdivani setting the precedent, Riventh reinforcing it, and Rubarosa perfecting the art of the multi-million-dollar goodbye. The slow but steady hemorrhage, combined with her own legendary spending on jewels, palaces, yachts, and an ever-present entourage, had done what the Great Depression and 2 world wars could not. It had critically depleted one of America's greatest family fortunes. The money that was supposed to last 1,000 lifetimes was, by the 1960s, revealing its limits, a terrifying reality for a woman who had never known any other way to navigate the world. This final divorce completed her transformation in the public eye, from a figure of tragic glamour to an outright cautionary tale. The narrative was no longer about a poor little rich girl to be pitied, but about a profoundly foolish woman who had squandered an unimaginable birthright on a procession of unworthy men. Newspaper and magazine profiles, which had once chronicled her parties and fashion with breathless admiration, now took on a tone of morbid fascination and thinly veiled scorn. She was portrayed as the architect of her own misery, a serial bride whose terrible judgment was matched only by her bottomless neediness. The 7 marriages became a punchline, a symbol of excess and emotional incompetence. This public shift was deeply isolating. Where she had once been a source of aspirational fantasy, she was now an object lesson in what not to do with vast wealth, a relic from a bygone era of extravagance that seemed increasingly out of touch with the post-war world. Spiritually and emotionally, the end of her 7th marriage left her in a state of near total desolation. The cycle had always been the same: intense hope, followed by disillusionment, culminating in a costly and humiliating failure. After 7 repetitions, the mechanism of hope itself was broken. There was no next husband to dream about, no new title to aspire to, no fresh continent to escape to. All that remained was the unvarnished truth she had spent a lifetime and a fortune trying to avoid. She was utterly alone. The grand palaces and hotel suites she still occupied were cavernous and silent, inhabited only by a rotating staff of paid employees. Her relationship with her only son, Lance, was strained and distant, a heartbreaking replication of the very parental neglect she had suffered. The men were all gone, The friends had drifted away, and the spotlight of public fascination had become a harsh, unforgiving glare. She had successfully purchased the attention of the world, but she had failed to secure a single person who would stay when the money was no longer the primary attraction. This profound isolation accelerated the physical decline that had been creeping up on her for years. Decades of substance abuse had taken a brutal, irreversible toll on her body. Her reliance on alcohol and a cocktail of prescription pills uppers to face the day, downers to escape the night, was no longer a coping mechanism. It was a slow-motion suicide. The vibrant young woman from the 1930 debutante photos was now a gaunt, frail figure. Her skin was pallid, her hands often trembled, and her once radiant energy had been replaced by a pervasive lethargy. The drugs and alcohol, which had once served as a shield against emotional pain, were now attacking her from within, damaging her liver, weakening her heart, and clouding her mind. She was trapped in a vicious cycle where the loneliness drove her to drink and take pills, and the side effects of those substances only made her more isolated, incapable of engaging with the world in any meaningful way. The gilded cage was now a hospital room, and the jailer was her own addiction. While the relentless parade of husbands and the slow drain of her fortune formed the public narrative of Barbara Hutton's decline, a far more intimate and devastating tragedy was unfolding in the private shadows of her life. The heartbreaking story of her only child, Lance. Born into the cold opulence of her second marriage to Count Kurt von Haugwitz-Reven. Lance's life was, from its very first breath, preordained by the same cruel dynamics that had plagued his mother. He was not so much a wanted child as he was an heir, a symbol, and ultimately, a casualty of a family legacy defined by emotional neglect and the suffocating weight of unearned wealth. His existence became a mirror reflecting back the very childhood Barbara had endured, a cycle of loneliness and abandonment that she, despite all her good intentions, proved tragically powerless to break. From the beginning, Barbara was ill-equipped for motherhood, her own emotional toolkit containing nothing but the implements of her own neglected upbringing. She replicated the patterns of her father, Franklin Hutton, with a chilling accuracy. Just as she had been handed off to a succession of nannies and governesses, so too was Lance. He was raised in a series of magnificent, echoing estates, cared for by a rotating staff of paid employees who attended to his every material need, but could offer none of the consistent, unconditional affection a child requires to build a secure sense of self. Barbara was often physically absent, perpetually traveling the globe in her restless search for distraction, or emotionally unavailable, lost in the fog of her pills and the drama of her latest marital crisis. Her attempts at connection were clumsy and infrequent, often manifesting as extravagant, guilt-driven gifts: a custom-built sports car for his 16th birthday, a trust fund of staggering proportions, that were poor substitutes for the simple, sustained presence of a mother. This emotional distance was compounded by the toxic presence of his father, Count Reventhow, who viewed his son not with paternal pride, but with open resentment and cold indifference. The Count saw Lance as a rival for Barbara's attention, and more pointedly, as a direct threat to his own financial and social standing within the marriage. He was frequently cruel, excluding the boy from family activities and making it clear he was an unwelcome burden. Barbara, trapped between her fear of her domineering husband and her own deep-seated inability to provide maternal protection, often retreated from the conflict, leaving Lance to navigate his childhood loneliness alone. This dynamic created a perfect storm of neglect, leaving the boy with a profound and unshakable conviction of his own unworthiness, a belief that he was somehow fundamentally unlovable. As Lance grew into a young man, he carried this internal void with him, a heavy inheritance that proved far more burdensome than any financial trust. He struggled terribly to find his own identity, forever trapped in the long shadow of his famous mother and labeled by the world as the Reventhow heir. What was there for him to strive for? His life's financial security was guaranteed, rendering ambition and hard work seemingly pointless. He drifted through a series of schools without distinction and floated through life with no clear direction, his existence lacking the purpose and structure that often comes from the need to earn one's own way. He was handsome, charming, and immensely wealthy. Yet these apparent advantages were, in reality, a gilded cage that isolated him from authentic experiences and made it nearly impossible to form relationships not tinged with the suspicion of ulterior motives. His relationship with his mother evolved into a complex and painful dance of mutual disappointment and unspoken longing. In his adult years, they would have brief, intense periods of reconnection, often fueled by Barbara's fleeting bursts of maternal guilt. She would lavish him with money and expensive gifts, trying to purchase the closeness they had never naturally developed. But these attempts always faltered as the deep-seated patterns of their past reasserted themselves. Lance, grappling with his own demons and a simmering resentment toward the mother who had never been there, would pull away. Barbara, wounded by his distance and interpreting it as a personal rejection, would retreat back into her own world of isolation. They were two wounded souls, bound by blood and tragedy, but separated by a chasm of misunderstanding and unmet emotional needs that all the money in the world could not bridge. The catastrophic conclusion to this decades-long tragedy arrived on a calm day in 1972. Lance, then 36 years old, was piloting a small private aircraft over the Mojave Desert in California. The plane crashed under circumstances that were never fully explained, killing him instantly. The news reached Barbara, who was by then a frail and reclusive figure, living in a hotel suite in Los Angeles. The loss was utterly shattering, a blow from which she would never recover. While the public viewed it as another sad headline in the Hutton saga, for Barbara, it was the ultimate and most personal failure of her life. All the marriages had ended, the fortune was dwindling, but those were external losses. The death of her son was an internal annihilation. It was the final, brutal proof that the cycle of neglect she had inherited from her own father had now culminated in the literal death of the next generation. In the grim aftermath of Lance's death, those few who still had contact with Barbara described a woman completely hollowed out by grief. The death of her son overshadowed every other sorrow, every financial loss, every marital humiliation. The money had failed to protect him. Her titles had meant nothing, and her frantic search for love in the arms of 7 different men had only served to distract her from the one relationship that truly mattered. The phrase, "poor little rich girl," now carried a weight far beyond financial ruin. It spoke to a poverty of spirit so profound that it had outlived her own child. The echoing silence in her luxurious hotel rooms was now filled with the ghost of the boy she never really knew. A perpetual, aching reminder of the maternal love she had never been able to give or receive. This was the loss that no settlement could ever resolve, the debt that no fortune could ever repay. To fully grasp the sheer scale of the financial catastrophe, one must first understand that Barbara Hutton's spending was not merely extravagant. It was a systemic, almost industrial-scale operation of wealth consumption. The foundation of her financial life was a paradox. She possessed one of the largest fortunes in the world, yet she had absolutely no understanding of how to manage it, nor any genuine interest in doing so. The discipline and acumen that had built the Woolworth empire over decades were entirely absent in its primary heir. She viewed her fortune not as capital to be stewarded, but as an inexhaustible resource, a magic well that would always refill no matter how many buckets were drawn from it. This profound lack of financial literacy, combined with a deep-seated emotional need to use money as a substitute for love, created a perfect storm for fiscal ruin. The $50 million inheritance she received in 1933, a sum equivalent to well over $1 billion today, was not lost in a single dramatic collapse, but was instead whittled away over 40 years by a relentless trio of forces: gargantuan divorce settlements, legendary personal spending, and a relentless ecosystem of opportunists who saw her not as a person, but as a walking treasury to be plundered. The most publicized and systematic drain on her wealth was, without question, the succession of divorce settlements, which functioned less like legal resolutions and more like state-sanctioned bank heists. Her first husband, the so-called Prince Alexis Mdivani, set the devastating precedent, walking away with over $1 million after a marriage of just 2 years, a sum that made him a wealthy man for life and signaled to every fortune hunter in Europe that a union with Barbara Hutton was the most lucrative career move imaginable. This was merely the opening act. Her second husband, the controlling Count von Haugwitz-Riebenthal, secured a multi-million-dollar settlement after a marriage that was as emotionally abusive as it was financially costly. But it was her sixth husband, the professional playboy Porfirio Rubarosa, who perfected the art of the payout. His 53-day marriage netted him a legendary settlement of $1 million in cash, on top of the custom-converted B-25 bomber, a fleet of sports cars, and other lavish gifts. Each divorce was more expensive than the last, creating a vicious cycle where her desperation for love led her to men who saw her as a short-term, high-yield investment, with the divorce decree serving as their final invoice for services rendered. Beyond the settlements themselves were the astronomical legal fees, as teams of high-priced attorneys fought protracted battles across international courts. These costs were a constant, grinding expense, a necessary tax on her perpetual marital turmoil. But the financial bleeding wasn't confined to the end of her relationships. It was embedded in their very fabric. During her marriage to Cary Grant, her spending became a point of serious contention, as the self-made movie star watched in bewildered frustration as she acquired yet another palace or suite of jewels with the casual air of someone buying a magazine. For Grant, this was a terrifying lack of discipline. For Barbara, It was simply the grammar of her existence. She financed Rubirosa's entire polo team and bought him his own airline. She supported Prince Trubetskoy's racing career and bankrolled Gottfried von Kram's return to tennis. In every instance, her fortune was not just shared. It was deployed as a tool to purchase and maintain the affection of the men in her life, a strategy that consistently produced the most expensive and soul-crushing results. Parallel to the marital siphoning was her legendary personal extravagance, a level of consumption so vast it seems almost mythical. Her spending was not focused on a single vice, but was a holistic lifestyle of absolute excess. Her collection of jewels was among the most magnificent in private hands, rivaling those of royalty. She owned the legendary McLean diamond, a stunning 40-carat stone, and possessed a collection of emeralds so rare they were considered priceless. Her real estate portfolio was a global empire of opulence. At various times, she owned a palatial apartment on New York's Fifth Avenue, a sprawling estate in Tangier known as the Sultana, a massive villa in Cuernavaca, Mexico, and a breathtaking palace in Rome, each staffed by dozens of servants and maintained at immense cost. Her travel was conducted via private trains and chartered yachts, and she was almost never without a vast personal entourage that included secretaries, hairdressers, masseuses, and personal physicians, all on full-time salary. This entourage points to the third, and perhaps most insidious, drain on her fortune: the army of hangers-on and so-called advisors who perpetually surrounded her. Isolated and emotionally vulnerable, Barbara was extraordinarily susceptible to flattery and poor counsel. Aides and managers exploited her generosity, submitting inflated bills, taking kickbacks from suppliers, and encouraging her most impulsive purchases to secure their own commissions. Her trust in people was as misplaced as her spending was reckless. While her grandfather, Frank Woolworth, had a keen eye for a good business deal, Barbara became a magnet for bad investments. She was easily swayed by smooth-talking promoters with dubious schemes, pouring millions into failed business ventures, from questionable oil deals to ill-conceived real estate developments that promised massive returns but invariably collapsed, taking her capital with them. Her financial advisors, who should have been protecting her interests, often seemed more focused on preserving their own lucrative access, rarely saying no to her and never establishing any meaningful budgetary controls. The combination of these forces, the marital payouts, the relentless lifestyle spending, and the predatory circle of confidants, created a financial death by 1,000 cuts. It is a profound misconception to believe she simply shopped her way to poverty. The reality was far more systemic. The fortune was being attacked from every conceivable angle simultaneously. While she might spend $100,000 on a single party, her husband of the moment might be quietly transferring $1 million to a secret bank account. While she was purchasing a $200,000 necklace, a business manager might be investing $2 million in a doomed venture that promised to mine gold from seawater. The money was not just flowing out. It was being actively pulled out by dozens of hands, all working in concert, whether they knew it or not, to deplete the reservoir. By the 1960s, the warning signs were becoming impossible to ignore, even for her. The once limitless trusts were straining. she began to sell off assets, first the lesser jewels, then the secondary homes. The palace in Rome was sold, then the Tangier estate. Each sale was a stopgap measure, a temporary infusion of cash that would soon be absorbed by her unchanged lifestyle and the enduring costs of her past. The global economic landscape had also shifted. The Woolworth Company itself, the very engine of her wealth, was beginning its own long decline, its retail dominance eroded by newer, more agile competitors. The dividends that had once flowed so reliably began to diminish, tightening the vise further. Her financial world was shrinking, but her psychological need to spend as a demonstration of her identity and worth remained as powerful as ever, creating a terrifying race between her dwindling resources and her undiminished compulsions. The Gilded life was beginning to show its brass underpinnings, revealing a future that was not just lonely, but for the first time, genuinely impoverished. The final chapter of Barbara Hutton's life unfolded not in a palace or a Mediterranean villa, but within the faded, floral-patterned walls of a modest suite at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel. This was a far cry from the opulent, staff-filled estates of her past. It was a quiet, rented room where the most constant presence was not a friend or a lover, but the profound, echoing silence of her own solitude. By the late 1970s, the woman who had once traversed the globe with an entourage of dozens now lived with just a single, loyal maid. The phone, that once insistent instrument of party invitations and suitors' calls, rarely rang. Her world had shrunk to these few rooms, a claustrophobic museum of memories where she would spend hours staring at old photograph albums, gazing at the ghost of the vibrant debutante she had once been, a beautiful stranger from another lifetime. The gilded cage had finally rusted shut, and she was its only occupant, utterly and heartbreakingly alone. Her physical state was a devastating reflection of her inner disintegration. Decades of relentless substance abuse had exacted a terrible, irreversible toll. Her body was a battlefield of competing ailments, each one a testament to a different form of self-medication. A lifetime of using alcohol to numb her emotional pain had ravaged her liver, resulting in advanced cirrhosis, a condition that left her weak, jaundiced, and in constant physical discomfort. At the same time, a lifelong struggle with her body image and a deep-seated nervousness had spiraled into a severe form of anorexia. She existed on a near-starvation diet of broth and dry toast, her frame becoming so emaciated and frail that she was often mistaken for a woman decades older. The vibrant, golden-haired girl from the newspaper headlines was now a wisp of a figure, weighing less than 90 pounds, her famous beauty hollowed out by illness and neglect. The very medications she had relied on for decades to manage her anxiety and insomnia now conspired against her in a final, cruel betrayal. Her system was so saturated with a cocktail of prescription sedatives, painkillers, and stimulants that she had developed a condition known as polypharmacy, where the drugs themselves interact to create new, debilitating symptoms and accelerate physical decline. Her personal physicians, who had for years enabled her dependencies with a steady stream of prescriptions, were now managing a terminal case, treating the symptoms of a sickness they had helped to create. The pills that had once offered escape now only deepened her isolation, clouding her mind and further separating her from the dwindling few who try to reach her. She was trapped in a vicious chemical loop where the only relief from one ailment was the cause of another. The supreme, gut-wrenching irony of her situation was captured in a single, stark newspaper headline that circulated after her death. "Poor little rich girl dies penniless." The phrase that had been a cynical media nickname for most of her life had, in the end, become her literal, unvarnished reality. The financial empire that had seemed as solid and eternal as a mountain had been eroded, grain by grain, by a relentless half-century of divorce settlements, predatory advisors, and her own incomprehensible spending. While she was not literally destitute, small, complex trusts still provided for her most basic needs. The reality was a form of genteel poverty that was, in its own way, more shocking than outright ruin. The woman who had once casually gifted a converted bomber plane to a husband could now barely afford the upkeep on her hotel suite. The legendary jewelry collection, worth tens of millions, had been almost entirely sold off to pay debts and maintain a semblance of her former life. She died possessing a fraction of her original inheritance, a financial collapse so complete it defied belief. Her final days in May of 1979 were a quiet, lonely vigil. A heart attack, the final failure of a body worn out by a lifetime of excess and anguish, was the immediate cause. She slipped into a coma and passed away on May 11th, with no family at her bedside. The news of her death was met with a global outpouring of remembrance, but it was a remembrance tinged with morbid fascination and a sense of grim inevitability. The world had watched her drama unfold for nearly 50 years, and now the curtain had fallen on the final, tragic act. Her body was flown back to New York, and she was interred in the family mausoleum at Westchester Hills Cemetery, laid to rest beside the mother whose suicide had set this entire tragic saga in motion so many decades before. In death, she was finally reunited with the one person whose loss she had spent her entire life and fortune trying to overcome, closing a circle of profound and enduring sorrow. So where does this leave us with the story of Barbara Hutton? Her life stands as a stark and enduring monument to one of humanity's most persistent questions. Can immense wealth truly buy happiness? Her story provides a devastatingly clear answer. The inheritance she received was not a blessing, but a curse of almost mythical proportions, a golden weight that bent the very arc of her existence. It isolated her from the genuine struggles that build character. It attracted a relentless parade of suitors who saw not her soul, but her bank balance. And it created a vacuum of purpose that no amount of spending could ever hope to fill. The central tragedy of Barbara Hutton is not that she died with very little money, but that she lived with so very little of everything else that gives life meaning. Authentic connection, earned self-worth, and unconditional love. She becomes the ultimate symbol of the Gilded Age heiress, a figure whose life reveals the profound dark side of extreme privilege. In her, we see the final, logical conclusion of a world built on spectacle and status, where human value becomes confused with net worth. Her 7 marriages were not a search for partners, but a desperate, lifelong quest for a salvation that no single person could ever provide. Each union began as a fairy tale and ended as a financial transaction, a cycle that systematically stripped away her fortune and her spirit in equal measure. The men she chose were not the cause of her misery. They were symptoms of a deeper sickness, a profound loneliness born in a childhood devoid of consistent, nurturing love, a void that followed her from a lonely Long Island mansion to a lonely hotel room in Beverly Hills. Ultimately, Barbara Hutton's story is a cautionary tale that transcends its era, speaking directly to our own modern obsession with wealth, fame, and external validation. Her life forces us to confront the critical difference between being wealthy and being rich in the ways that matter. She had limitless financial capital, but she was bankrupt in emotional and spiritual currency. She could purchase any material object her heart desired, but she could not purchase a single moment of genuine peace or a relationship free from the shadow of her money. Her existence serves as a powerful reminder that the most valuable things in life, trust, purpose, and deep, abiding connection, are not commodities to be acquired. They must be built, earned, and nurtured through shared experience and vulnerability, things her fortune made nearly impossible to achieve. Her legacy, then, is not found in the dwindled trusts or the sold-off jewels, but in the poignant and unsettling questions her life compels us to ask ourselves. What truly constitutes a life well lived? Is the pursuit of wealth worth the potential cost to our relationships and our inner peace? Barbara Hutton had everything the world tells us we should want, and it brought her nothing but a profound and lasting sorrow. As we reflect on her extraordinary and heartbreaking journey, we are left with a final, haunting thought. The next time we find ourselves envying the seemingly perfect lives of the rich and famous, we might pause to remember the woman who had it all, and who, in the most important ways, had nothing at all. What do you believe her tragic story teaches us about the intricate balance between money, love, and true fulfillment? We would love to hear your reflections and insights in the comments below.